Hello, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of the Rockefeller Center, welcome to our tonight's discussion of Julian Assange and whether he's a visionary or a villain, featuring free speech attorney Nabiha Syed and Dartmouth lecturer Alexis Jetter. Before we get started, a couple of Zoom details. You may ask your questions at any time by using the Q&A button. And to upvote a question that you would like to see answered, click on the thumbs up icon. And the questions with the most thumbs up will rise to the top. And asking your questions early increases the odds that they will get answered. To access Zoom's closed captioning feature, navigate to the live transcript button and select show subtitle. If you don't see that option, look under the more button. And finally, when you leave tonight's webinar, you will see a 3-question survey, and we'd be very grateful if you would take the time to answer the brief questions that you'll see there. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our host for the evening, lecturer in Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and the Department of English at Dartmouth College, Alexis Jetter. Thank you all for being here tonight.
So I asked Nabiha Syed to be here tonight, talk with me about Julian Assange. Those of you who know anything about Julian Assange know he's the founder of Wikileaks. Very, very controversial, was responsible for exposing some very serious war crimes on the part of the United States. Nabiha, actually, who's a very well-known, respected free speech attorney, she currently is president of Markup, which is a new investigative reporting organization, but she also has a long history dealing with things like leaked and hacked and information about government secrets. She was vice president of BuzzFeed when they got the notorious Steele dossier, which we'll be getting to. But she also, when she was at Yale for her first law degree, she has 2, one from Yale, one from Oxford. When she was at Yale, she started a media law center, which she can talk about, the first one in the country. It's now 10 years old. And then she got a second law degree at Oxford, where she, as part of her thesis, actually met and interviewed Julian Assange. So she has a long history of not only of dealing with these kinds of issues, but he actually does have a sense of Julian Assange as a person and as an actor on the stage of, great government secrets revealed, and also as a reviled human being. And it presents some thorny issues about who supports him, who doesn't, and can we take a man who really is responsible for transforming the face of modern journalism and charge him with US espionage that could land him in jail for 175 years. So that's the general introduction. I think we're going to start, before I get into stuff with Nabiha, we're going to start with a short introduction to this issue. It's a recent piece by Mehdi Hasan, who is an MSNBC commentator, and it's called "We Have to Talk About Julian Assange." So why don't we let that roll? For those of you who know the situation, it will be interesting. For those of you who don't know the situation, it'll be a very useful primer. Well, Mehdi Hasan does a great job, I think, of laying out the issues, laying out the central question that I really want to talk about with Nabiha, and I know she's got a lot to say, but which is, if we go after Julian Assange, if the US government goes after Julian Assange, are we criminalizing journalism? And what message is that sending at a time when it's very, very difficult to be a journalist in the world? Journalists around the globe are being censored, arrested, incarcerated, tortured, and killed by governments and by paramilitary mercenaries. And it's a very dangerous time to be a journalist. And what kind of message is that sending from the US, which of course is the beacon for free speech and freedom of the press, if we're going after people who reveal war crimes? And what is it going to do specifically to journalists around the world who are trying to expose war crimes? And, those are some of the major questions I want to ask Nabiha, but I want to start out because Nabiha, as a law student, talked with Julian Assange. And I want you to know that this is an issue that she's been grappling with most of her adult life. And I'm really interested in how the issue has evolved for you, Nabiha, from the time you were a law student to the time you were at BuzzFeed, defending publication of the Steele dossier, what you learned about him at the time, what were your questions, and how has all that evolved in your own life?
Of course. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me and to parse such big, meaty questions I've been thinking about my entire professional career, but also even before that. So many, I could start in law school, but I'm actually going to time travel back to high school many, many moons ago, because I want to start with why I was drawn to this. And I was drawn to this because I wanted to answer a simple question, and I had a very simple, almost naive belief. So the simple question was, what does the public deserve to know? And that question became front and center to me as I was a 16-year-old in the aftermath of 9/11 in Orange County, California, pretty far away from New York. But countless people from my religious community, from my ethnic background, had the FBI knocking at their door, asking them all kinds of questions about what they knew. And that was just a normal part, a normal, horrifying, normal part of being Muslim American at that time. And it bore no resemblance to what I saw on television every day, which I've always had a news habit, so it's no surprise I'm in this business. On TV, I'd see questions like, are they with us or are they against us? And I was like, who's the we, who's the they? Like, what is this about? Like, I was born here, like my parents chose to become citizens and are so proud of being so. It all felt like, and this comes to the simple, naive belief, that if the American public knew more about what was happening, if they knew about the reality of Muslim American life, if they understood what was happening with the FBI, they'd feel differently. The framing would be different on TV. The questions would be different. And so that put that question, what does the public deserve to know about whom, who participates, like front and center as a driving force in my life, and took me to law school, took me to start to co-found one of the first media law clinic in the country, where we did a tremendous amount of national security oriented Freedom of Information Act work. We were writing FOIA requests and litigating to the Navy, to the FBI, to the State Department, to all of these places, going through an official process, right?
I got to stop, because I want to explain you can explain what FOIA is. Not everyone knows that.
So FOIA is fantastic. And for those in the audience who are unfamiliar with it, I am excited for this adventure for you. So it is your ability as a citizen, anyone, not a reporter, anyone as a citizen, you can file a request for existing records that the government agencies have, and they have to, in theory, give them to you. Sometimes it's slow. It's subject to a lot of exemptions for things like national security or law enforcement safety, but you can get these records as a form of you as a citizen having a right of oversight over the government. And this is a phenomenal democratic concept. You get to
called a Freedom of Information Act request, and that's what we call them, FOIAs.
Exactly.
Okay, there you go.
So I find myself in law school. We are filing tons of these FOIA requests, many of them about national security, about surveillance systems, about law enforcement overreach. And this is, 2008, 2009. So these questions they have been present for a long time, right? We've been probing these questions about, again, what does the public deserve to know? And you have to go through this sort of arcane, Byzantine, long process, simple in theory, complicated in practice. And lawyers are quite helpful in doing that because, of course, there's all kinds of rulings and precedent that govern what you can know and when. And then we realized that because of the advent of the internet, more and more people were able to publish directly to the internet without any sort of intermediary. There's no intermediary at all, right? You don't need to go through the New York Times. You don't need to go through BuzzFeed. You don't need to go through an editor or anyone. You can just get information and plug it straight onto the internet. And that is how this sort of fascination with what does the public deserve to know and who gets to tell them was that sort of follow-up piece, right? Like that hadn't entered the scene yet. Now it was who gets to tell them. We trust the New York Times to do it, I guess. We trust the Washington Post to do it, I guess. Do we trust anyone to do it? What does trust look like without intermediaries? So that became sort of the fascinating question, and that's how I stumbled across WikiLeaks. So I graduated law school, and it was, in the aftermath of the financial apocalypse. So rather than going to a law firm, I thought, let me get another law degree in England. And I just became fascinated with this question. Who gets to decide? When someone like Julian Assange publishes these collateral murder videos directly to the internet, right? So you can see for yourself. In some ways, spiritually, it almost felt like this is what I wish was happening in 2001, right? If only so many of us in these communities had been able to say, this is what's happening. Even more, jumping ahead a little bit, even now in the past few years, the terrifying ubiquity of police shootings and that video being made directly available through social platforms, we've seen what that's been able to do in terms of activating social movements. So it felt in 2009, 2010, like this was the thing I was going to study. So I started writing a thesis that was comparing the transparency philosophy of the founders of the Freedom of Information Act. What did they intend? Where did they see process as being valuable? What were the exceptions? What was the balance they struck about what the public gets to know and who decides? And comparing that to what we were seeing in WikiLeaks, something without intermediaries, far more radical, sort of sidestepping institutional process, at least as a necessity. And that is sort of what brought me to interviewing Julian. And what I have to say is the motivating spirit that he had was this: the public deserves to know. The public deserves to know, and they deserve to know now. What I thought was so fascinating about the undertone of the interview with him, again, many moons ago now, was the urgency, where he's like, I fully believe this information will come to light, but if it comes to light in 15 years' time and not today, what change is possible? Right? Will we be able to save lives? And so he was thinking about sort of the harm principle of the people who were dying and the public that was being duped as an emergency that was worth direct publication, and then partnering with news organizations to help amplify his work to other audiences, right? He was savvy about what distribution looked like, but he wanted the sort of raw, uncut version to be available to all. It was a much more radical vision of transparency. Whereas when you compare it to the people who were setting up the Freedom of Information Act, who at that time were radical too. The idea that you get to send a request to the government and they have to answer you is radical if you think about it. They were much more willing to make concessions around things like, well, this is law enforcement. This is an ongoing investigation. This is national security. We have to balance public safety. And urgency is important, but it's not the only factor, right? And so the process introduces other factors of importance, whereas for Julian, it felt that the urgency of change was something that he had to advocate for. And that sort of gloss of advocacy is something that's uncomfortable for a lot of people who identify as purely as journalists. So I'll pause there because I just threw a lot at you, but
no,
that's
great. It's great. Well, I mean, that raises the question, of course, of why it is that so many journalists say, not me, he's out there. He's not a journalist. People define themselves, even investigative journalists say, well, he's, I'm nothing like that. And there's this sort of good cop, bad cop thing. And I think personally, that's a very dangerous construct because, of course, if journalists really think, oh, they can go after Julian Assange and that's not going to affect me, that's very dangerous thinking because, of course, what the government is going after is precisely what journalists should be doing. And I want to talk a little bit about why journalists don't think that their ox is being gored, and yet at the same time, most of the big journalist organizations, Reporters Without Borders, Committee to Protect Journalism, Amnesty, and some other are really, particularly Reporters Without Borders, but they're really going to bat for him. Why would some journalists not see that their livelihood and their work is at stake, and why do others see it so clearly?
It's such a fascinating question. And I think some of it is honestly optics and emotional, right? Because the thing is, we exist on this continuum. The continuum is, how does the public get to know this information, right? And everyone's choosing different methods on that continuum. And there's discomfort with someone who is openly distasteful, has been accused of very unsavory things in his personal life. Not to belabor the point, but he seems like a bad guy. And like, not a lot of people want to be associated with a person who feels like he gives them a bad name, particularly in a time where the good work that's being done is often maligned and sort of muddied by these sort of personality characteristics. It's like the message is being lost in the noise of the bad optics. I will say that I think at a sort of higher level, I think there's sort of three interesting things that are happening here, right? Or three sort of distinguishing things that have also enabled the government to take a step towards prosecution, despite under the Obama administration, as we saw in that clip, quite a lot of trepidation about doing so. And this is also the three spaces in which we see some of the gradation on that spectrum of why Julian's a little bit different than other mainstream traditional journalists. So the first one is harm. It's like a consciousness of harm principle, right? And you see that in the superseding indictment about Assange, the allegation that his publication of the State Department cables in particular revealed a ton of names that put people in direct danger. Whether the proof is entered into the evidence of that, but that's the allegation, right? You disclose names that you shouldn't have. And it's worth noting that when the New York Times, also participated in the story, they redacted a whole lot of names. They did not take quite the radical transparency approach that Julian did. And that's an important thing for folks, especially folks who haven't been in a newsroom, to really grapple with, where there is a lot of internal consideration of like, do we include this informant's name? Right? Does it add something to the story? Do we include the source's name, or do we bet on that reporter source confidentiality to not? There's a lot of discretion exercised in the practice of protecting against harm. And there's something about the radical transparency, sort of throw it up on a website disclosure, that challenges that implicit process, right? And it's also the basis for the prosecution. So that's bucket number one, is harm. The second one is my favorite to talk about. Every time I teach media law and First Amendment, I teach at Columbia and CUNY, people are stunned by this. And the second really has to do with the line between news gathering and conspiracy, right? Now, you think that should be pretty clear, right? But there's a really interesting fiction that the law creates based on a 2001 case, the Bartnicki v. Vopper case, that sort of sets up the legal protection for news gathering. And if you'll allow me, if you'll indulge me, I'd love to tell you the story of the Supreme Court case, because it is really interesting.
Go ahead.
So,
I can't stop you anyway. Go ahead. It's a town in Pennsylvania. There's a raging union fight going on around school unions. And all of a sudden, a radio station, they wake up one morning and they see a package on their front doorstep. No idea where the package comes from. They see what's in the package. It's a tape. And it's a tape of two people in the union talking about how if things don't change with these negotiations, violence is possible, right? Violence is on the agenda. The radio station hears this and they're like, what could be more newsworthy than this, right? What could be more newsworthy than this about this raging fight that's happening? So they play the entire recording. It is clear when you listen to the recording that it was an illegal tape. The two people talking did not intend for this to be recorded. So someone committed an illegal act in recording this, and the radio station published it. And so the question of whether the radio station has any culpability at all goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. This is 2001, okay? This is not like 1700s. This is really, really recent about what do we allow? What can the public know? And how does illegality in the pipeline of that affect the ultimate outcome? And it's actually, for the nerds amongst you, or the people who maybe want to go to law school one day, it is absolutely worth reading the Supreme Court opinions here, because you can see the justices grappling with this, where they're like, if we say okay to upstream illegal behavior, are we creating an incentive for it? If we disallow it, are we prohibiting the public from knowing something that is clearly in their interest? What do? So they strike a balance and they say, so long as the subject matter is clearly in the public interest, prong one. Prong two, that the reporter has played no part in soliciting it. No part in it at all. It's literally the equivalent of coming in over the transom, is the language from the case, meaning in this example, opening the door and seeing it there, right? Then that's fine. That's fine. That's the law. But you and I know, anyone who's ever done any reporting knows that like a source doesn't always just drop stuff off at your door. You got to talk to them. You ask them, you say, it would be nice to have more support for this. Like, I wish I could publish it, but I need some proof. Like, there's a dance that happens. But pre-technology, that dance happened in the dark, happened in a parking lot, happened face-to-face, happened in sort of quick meetings. Now it happens on email chats, on phones, on all these things that are subject to the surveillance of the government. So it's much easier to poke holes in that fiction that we could tell ourselves in 2001. And what this sets up, right, going back to Assange, what this sets up is the law protects a very particular type of news gathering
even though reality sort of pressures that sort of imagination. And it makes it easy to say, well, this sort of asking someone to, just go back and check. Can you just see if there's any other files that you could download and give to me? Oh, do you need help? You need help breaking those passwords? I could help you. That's what starts to veer it into hacking land, as we saw in the clip, right? And that's where you start to see more space for the sort of conspiracy aspect of this. This really is exploiting an ambiguity in the law that many people are quite afraid of, right? And what happens when people are afraid? Some people run to it to say, we got to protect this zone, right? We can't let it become conspiracy. And other people say, well, I never did that anyway. I only ever got things over the transom, which you and I know is not true. But I think that's a little bit of what's happening. And then the last third piece, I promise I'll be quick on this one, but
you're good. You're good.
The last one is really, I think, an anxiety. It's a deep, deep, deep-seated anxiety about process and a process and institutions. We live in a time where all kinds of institutions we rely on are crumbling, right? And media institutions are not above that. And so this idea that like, well, the New York Times and the Washington Post and yes, even BuzzFeed and all of these other places, we are an institution. We have a process. We have editors who fight out whether something is valuable. We have all kinds of people in the team asking these questions about harm or about the appropriate form of news gathering. The institution is seen as a protection for those things that we value, that we know that we value in the law. And if you say that you don't need the institution to publish anymore, who's going to be the check? Who's going to ask, are you sure we're not harming anyone? Who's going to ask, are you sure that's how you're going to news gather? Who's going to train? Do we descend into total madness and chaos? And I think that's like on the emotional level, right? The anxiety, the desire to distinguish, to differentiate, to distance is really about the anxiety of like, who is the decider of these things when institutions go away? And that one's hard to answer, right? But I do think that's a big piece of what's happening.
And that's, I do want to get into the law here, because isn't it strange that this Australian citizen is being accused of espionage under US espionage laws? And what Julian Assange says, and this gets right to what you'd said, is he is the publisher. Chelsea Manning was the hacker. Chelsea Manning leaked it to him. And words matter here, right? Because we could call Chelsea Manning a whistleblower, and we'd all feel good about her, right? Or you could call her a leaker, and then you don't feel quite as good about her. Or you can call her a hacker, and you definitely don't feel good about her. But what Julian Assange is being accused of, aside from soliciting this information from Chelsea Manning, and let's talk about what some of that information was. I'd love for you to talk about the Apache helicopter video, because that's when WikiLeaks first sort of exploded into the public scene. That's certainly when I first heard about it. But it is this very odd thing where he, I mean, you and I have talked about this. He's being accused, and he faces 175 years in prison for basically exposing war crimes. And Azmat Khan from the New York Times has just published a 2-part series in which she exposes US war crimes. And she's probably going to get a Pulitzer for it. And he's facing 175 years in prison. And I think that really is the central question that I'd love you to sort of sink your teeth into. Why is this man who's not even a US citizen facing 175 years in a supermax prison in the US? And this astonishing young journalist is being hailed as one of the finest journalists of her generation for exposing pretty much the same thing, which is the callous disregard for civilian life as the US bombs countries in which we say we're going after military targets, and increasingly, and over the past decade and longer, we've massacred civilians instead.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between them only makes sense when you talk about process and not outcome. Because if you talk about the outcome, well, the outcome for both, of course, and the outcome for a tremendous amount of journalism that we all read, enjoy, and hopefully pay for every single day is the revelation of government harm, right? Or a powerful actor harm. That's the outcome. And I think we can agree that in terms of outcomes, Julian absolutely accomplished the like the deep heartbeat of what journalism is for, is to expose wrongdoing. The difference is in the process, right? And that's whether that should be enough to justify the delta between Pulitzer and 175 years in jail is the question. Because, and you can start, when you dig into the process, then you can of course start to say, well, okay, you know, someone like Azmat was meticulous and part of a process, part of an institution to make sure that people were not being needlessly harmed in her disclosure, right? That her news gathering employed, I mean, tremendous amounts of FOIA requests. I've had the joy before in my career to write FOIA requests for Azmat, and I gotta say, she is tenacious in how she processes this, but goes through the process, right? Asking the government, and then confirming with the government, and then getting their records and saying, really, because I went on the ground and I took a picture exactly where you took a picture, and that's not what I saw. And that method, right, of the engaging with the government on their terms, that process is quite different from Julian's, right? The process is very different. And again, the institutions that are the bearers of this, it goes back to that question, what does the public deserve to know, and who gets to tell them? That is what is at stake here, because the process is part of that institutional who question. Not everyone who's like a freelancer or a solo publisher running a website is going to be able to engage in that kind of expensive, laborious, lengthy process, right? And we have sort of technologies of publication that allow far beyond, you know, WikiLeaks was like 1.0. People have Substacks, people are on social media, people are live publishing without intermediaries, without institutions, every single day. And that causes this kind of anxiety. And so creating such a delta of outcomes, such a difference in outcomes based on process, does feel quite dangerous to me, because many people are engaging all along the spectrum. It's very hard. And we have these sort of two examples of the other ends of the spectrum.
And the other thing I wanted to mention, looks like we might have a question here, is when you read Azmat's article, and you know this better than most people, sure, she filed a whole lot of Freedom of Information Act requests and nothing happened, or very little happened, or she got a lot of things with all the information kind of redacted. She had to file, the Times had to file a bunch of lawsuits. Mm-hmm. That's what freed up a lot of the information, was lawsuits. Mm-hmm. You're in a better position than most to say what the relationship was between the FOIA requests and lawsuits, but they had to win the lawsuits. I mean, it wasn't just having the deep pockets to file them, they had to win them. And it took years. Okay, yep. So it took years and years. Now, the other side of that is that it gave her time to go on the ground. And here's the irony, right? It was safer for her to go on the ground after the Taliban won. Yep. Because it was, you know, people weren't bombing as much. Also, what's interesting from Azmat's article, and I think I was talking about that with my students today, is it sheds a lot of light on why the Taliban was able to just roll over the country so quickly and take power, you know, in days and weeks, if that, because the drone bombing of civilians was so severe that people just wanted it to be over. And they wanted the Americans to stop killing their families. So that kind of on the ground reporting has been so important. But that kind of on the ground reporting is really endangered when the US goes after what looks to the world like journalism, right? So you've got all these dictators, and I want you to start talking about the global implications of this, Nabiha, I know you can. You've got all these dictators and popularly elected authoritarian governments around the world who don't need the US government to prosecute Julian Assange to do terrible things to journalists and to their own people, because once they wipe out the press, there's really no one to sort of watch whatever they're doing. But what's the additional damage for the US to be saying, well, this is espionage and we're going to put you away for 175 years? What kind of message, A, does that send to authoritarian governments around the globe? Also, what kind of fig leaf is it going to provide Donald Trump if he's, you know, back as president in 2024, or someone like Trump in 2024 to come down on the press in very, very dangerous and severe ways, in ways that people who want to dismiss Julian Assange might regret not seeing their relationship to him.
Yeah, it's a terrifying picture you paint, but it's a real one. Right? Which is like, we should underscore that in this moment, the American press is not in the stature reputationally or financially as like the Washington Post or the New York Times of like 50 years ago, right? 50, 60 years ago. This is a time where it is hard to make money as a journalist. It is hard to make money as these kinds of institutions in deep investigative reporting. I can tell you this as the president of an investigative organization, when you read those long form stories, you're looking at something that often costs $500,000 to produce, right? It is expensive to do this and the money is not free flowing. To add to that, the injury that you will be thrown in jail for your job where you barely get health insurance is quite the deterrent for people who are looking to enter the truth-telling industry, right? That's terrifying. And so if you just look at it just nakedly, right? What are the incentives for someone to become this kind of truth-telling investigative journalist? It is a terrifying thing to do. It has always been a terrifying thing to do. You're going up against the most powerful actors in the world. And you could get thrown in jail. And at least historically, at least in recent history, there was this feeling of like, yeah, you don't get rich. It's kind of scary. People get really mad at you. There's death threats, but at least the Constitution, we recognize that the Constitution in our democracy depends on you, depends on that. And that's enough to draw some people. The moment you start saying, yeah, maybe not, like maybe not, maybe actually you guys are spies. Maybe some of you are spies, maybe you're not. That's again, a burden on the supply of people who even want to go into this. And that to me is so chilling because this is a thankless, difficult, deeply important job. On the global stage, right? You take that sort of harm and it just amplifies times a billion because at least journalists throughout the world who are carrying the torch of like the importance of giving the public what they deserve to know, right? Acting on behalf of the public and at least bearing witness to the harm that they suffer. Even if you can't solve it right away, at the very least, maybe you can offer someone the gift of bearing witness to what they've gone through. There's some feeling that maybe if something really bad happened, you could be resettled in the US. You could be resettled somewhere else. Someone would come get you, not for everybody, but for some. And I think we're seeing the reduction in that perception, right? People look at the US and say like, oh, do you really support free speech? First of all, what is happening in your media ecosystem looks a little wild over there with misinformation. And also you elected a leader, at least once, who openly maligns what we do. And then the administration after that is prosecuting. It starts to weaken that feeling that like someone in the world is also looking out for you if you're carrying the torch of freedom, oversight, and accountability. That is a really scary thing for journalists worldwide to be looking at. And, you know, for these authoritarian governments that do things like liquidate journalists in vats of acid, they didn't need an excuse. But what this does is it takes away sort of the moral high ground to say, you're bad, we're good, and whatever sort of negotiating power that gives to say like, we're for democracy, you're authoritarian. It's sort of in the sort of public relations game of this weakens that argument in a way that adds to the terror of people who are like, who's going to be there for us? Who's carrying the torch of democracy and journalism if it's not the United States? And it's a scary set of questions.
It is scary. I'm going to now go to some of the questions that people have generated from the audience. Let's say all that you're saying is good and important, but you've quickly glossed over the point that a crime was probably committed in obtaining the information. Is it okay to commit crimes to reveal crimes?
No. And I'm sorry I glossed over it quickly. I thought giving it sort of a table in one of my three would be enough. But no, I do not believe that it's okay to commit crimes as a general blanket principle. It's not okay to commit crimes to reveal crimes. That said, we are all aware of laws that are seen as just in one time and unjust in another. And while I don't think that if it is true that the conspiring, encouraging, collaborating, and hacking, I do not think if that is true, that is something the law should defend. I think I have a pretty high threshold of wanting to understand, is that what happened? And crucially, like, especially given, you know, sort of the last question, are the stakes high enough to go after this kind of political case? There's an element of political consideration that has to come into play with a Espionage Act case that's delving into the criminalization of obtaining and publishing information in the public's interest. Is it politically worth it to clarify the point that no, you don't get to commit crimes in order to reveal crimes? Because I would say that that point is actually made all day, every day in the court system. I frequently advise my clients, other clients of like, yeah, no, I'm glad you got that picture. You definitely trespassed to do it, so we're not publishing that. Or a famous example, the Chiquita banana example, a lawyer high up in the Chiquita company found a reporter and said, you know, I have direct evidence of horrible human rights abuses that are happening on the banana farms owned by this company. You just need to call into my voicemail and you'll hear all the voicemail. So he hands the reporter the voicemail code. The reporter calls. The sorry, just got a phone call coming up on here. He calls in, he listens to the voicemail, he writes a damning expose about the human rights abuses committed by Chiquita Banana, and Chiquita's like, yeah, about that. You definitely hacked into our system by calling into the voicemail. And the entire story, they write a retraction of the story, or an apology for the story, not a retraction. Lawsuits happen, terrible things happen. The truth was lost in the muddiness of the criminality that resulted in that outcome. Every single day, there are cases where we say it's not okay to commit a crime just to tell the truth. Do we need this one in this extraordinary setting with stakes as high as the Espionage Act to reiterate a fact that we already know? I don't know. And again, are we even sure that those facts are there yet as we sort of lay judgment on this admittedly unsavory person?
And I will say that according to other people who work with Julian Assange, and of course that's a big according to, he doesn't just throw things up against the wall and see what sticks. That actually there's a fair amount of vetting that goes on there. Let me move to another question. This is, how do you feel the steady weakening of FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, that Congress has engaged in ever since it was passed, affects Assange's decision to do what he did? Also, the fact that even when FOIA was strongest, files usually came to people with a lot of vital information blacked out. Did he feel that there was really no other way to get information to people?
I can tell you, without having made the FOIA comparison and talking to him, he did feel there was no other way. He felt that there was no other way. Again, that goes back to sort of the urgency he felt. Like there was no other way for this to guarantee that the full horror of what he had obtained was made public, right? He really believed the public deserved to see it. But I think you raise a fascinating point, right? Look, there's only so many ways the public can know something, so either through authorized disclosures, right? Like things the government chooses to tell you voluntarily, requested disclosures, things that you ask for to be like, excuse me, I'd like to know this, or unauthorized disclosures like leaks, right? Which may be mediated through institutions like the Times, or may not be mediated through institutions and go directly up onto a website like Wikileaks. That's it. It's not that, there's no magic to it. There's only a couple of ways. And if you start to like close the spigot for the other ones, right? Let's say the official narrative, as we see in many authoritarian regimes, is double talk nonsense. Like the public knows it's not true, but that's what's happening. And the requested disclosures are slow, laborious, require a team of lawyers, all in all, cost, tens of thousands of dollars. Of course, it's going to put pressure. If you believe the truth ultimately comes out, which I deeply do, of course, that creates pressure. Of course, it creates pressure and incentive for whistleblowers, for leakers, for people whose consciences will not allow this harm to continue. They're going to say something. And so that if you want to shut off that last and final spigot of truth, what do? Some regimes kill those people. Some throw them in jail. But again, there's not that many playbooks. It's not that complicated, right? That's what it looks like. And so, were I Grand Poobah in charge of anything, I would say you would want to have more consistent open data sets volunteered by the government. You want more reliable information. You want to be better at answering those FOIA requests, because that should at least build public trust in the fact that the truth is going to get out there and you don't have to run to these other dangerous, unauthorized ways of doing it. Even that said, there will always be things that a powerful actor will never say about its own actions. Always, always. I'm not naive. There's always going to be that other lane. The question is, how big do you want that lane to be, and how extraordinary do you want the circumstances to be for it? And that's what policy is for.
Let me jump in here. This is actually a question from one of my students, so I'm doubly proud here. Why should journalists have to work with or for the government in uncovering and exposing government wrongdoing? How do we know that the government can be trusted not to set up too many barriers to information access and not to create or needlessly delay the process? Should Assange have the right to release information in his own time, on his own terms?
I mean, I think the question is, you have to go back to the fundamental principle of oversight, right? So it's one thing, and Azmat's work is actually a great example. Even before this exceptional piece, I had the joy of working with her on a piece called Ghost Schools at BuzzFeed, and it's totally worth a read for those of you who haven't encountered it. It's an early signal that, of course, she's going to be a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter. And Azmat did something quite brilliant, which was she requests, one narrative that the US military has had is no matter what's going on in Afghanistan, we went there, we did build schools. Okay. We made their lives better. They were in the Stone Age and we improved it. And she was able to get through official processes, right? A list of the schools that were built by the military throughout the country. And then she put on her shoes and her headscarf and went off to Afghanistan and visited all those coordinates. And she'd go and she'd take pictures and be like, this thing that's listed on this list as a school, it's a single wall. There's no toilet. Like, this is not a school. It's not functional. And so I think what that is, right? So to go to your question, there's an art to saying, this is what the government narrative is. And I checked it, right? I checked it. And that if you never went to the government in that first piece at all, they could just question the premise, right? To be like, I don't know where you got that list. That list seems crazy. And so there's a value in engaging in that kind of dialogue. And I do think the most effective reporters in engaging in that kind of dialogue, remember, the government's not a monolith. There's people inside the government who are also like, this is not a good policy. This is not great. We need to do something different. By engaging with them, you also potentially set yourself up for some policy evolution, which is ultimately the goal, right? And you see that in response to Azmat's story now, where you have people in the military saying like, yeah, you know what, we're going to look into this. This is really saying something.
Secretary of Defense, as a matter of fact.
Saying like, this is
yes.
we're going to do. And so I think, do you have to? No. Is it a credibility building thing? Yes. And if you go outside the process, like with anything, every society, every system is designed to processes. If you transgress the process, you can imagine a legal process wanting to bring you right back into it. And that's the risk that you run.
All right, a few more questions while we have a little bit of time. This is more of a philosophical question. We don't have a higher power authority for moral compass decisions that we share as a culture. Our justice system is good for on-the-ground stuff, but not for higher level moral compass work. And we have a few more questions after that, so we're going to ask you to...
Got it.
Yeah, pedal to the metal here.
Yeah, it's true. I don't know of many societies that have a unified moral authority, and we certainly have a schism, right, of different organizing principles in this country. But you have, and there's norms and there's law. And I think that actually speaks to what's so terrifying for many about journalistic institutions eroding, is that there wasn't a unifying principle, but there were like 5 networks and a handful of institutions. And we could say, well, they create journalistic ethics and journalistic norms that are knowable and mostly shared. And that is going to stand in for that sort of question of like, what is moral to disclose? What should be disclosed, right? And the law is there for tactics, but like these institutions hold those values. In a time where there are few institutions, no gatekeepers, and many people can participate, there's great because there's more voices at the table. More voices is more dissent. More dissent means no alignment. And you don't have a centralized authority. And some of it is like, that's kind of what you get when we move into a decentralized environment like ours. And it's a tough conundrum. And the legal system is going to stand in for the absence of institutions and normative sites really creating that unification.
Another question here, and then I have a final question for you about the Steele dossier. I'm not going to let you get away without talking about the Steele dossier. All right, this is from another student of mine. Should Assange's uncovering of war crimes through WikiLeaks be evaluated on the same terms as the work of actual journalists who are decidedly more careful with protecting names? What is the tipping point for open source platforms like WikiLeaks to be criminalized by government authorities? Why is Assange, as an individual, being criminalized to a life sentence for data leaking outcomes he may have set the parameters for, but did not personally orchestrate? Well, there's a lot in there. I guess
Yeah,
take it where you can and jump on it.
right. There's a lot in there. I would say a lot of it sort of goes back to those process-based, like what's the process, what's the form of news gathering, and what's the harm principle. And that really, those have to be the three pieces that you're looking at to sort of navigate what could and should be done.
All right, so now I'm going to take the opportunity in the 3 minutes I think I have remaining. When you were at BuzzFeed as the vice president, and I think also some big muckety muck in the legal department, you were presented with the Steele dossier, which I'm going to let you describe actually, but it is a highly controversial dossier compiled by a guy named, is it Chris Steele? I forget his first name, who was a former official spy for the United Kingdom. And it involves what he discovered in looking at a visit by Donald Trump when he was president to Moscow, as he occupied the hotel room of the very fancy Moscow hotel that President Obama and his wife had spent, I guess, a brief sojourn in. The Steele dossier is pointed to as the smoking gun for what Putin has on Trump, sort of. And you guys published something about it, which was seen as reckless because it was uncorroborated, and everyone else, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, pointed at you guys and said, BuzzFeed, you're so irresponsible. And yet maybe in the Steele dossier is the answer for why the Trump administration seems so cordial to Putin.
It was, I gotta say, I am no stranger to controversial moments in journalism. And so that one was a decision by our editor-in-chief at the time at BuzzFeed, Ben Smith. And Ben Smith was also, has such a deep belief that like the public deserves to know things that are at a level of importance, like maybe there's reason to believe that the incoming president of the United States has an uncommonly close relationship with agents of a not American ally, right? And I think the critical factor there, right? And it's a really interesting process question. A critical factor there was the realization that the Steele dossier wasn't just idle gossip. It wasn't just like little tidbits put together by someone in a slam book and put on the internet. That this was a set of observations made by someone who was a professional intelligence agent, although he was not employed in that capacity at the time he was putting it together, but he had quite a lot of good judgment, historically, at least. And it was circulated at the top echelons of the US government. It's not like someone saw this and said, this is garbage, putting it in the trash. There were briefings that happened. These were being investigated. And that seemed to Ben, and I agree with this, an argument for why the public deserved to know that something that serious was happening. And it sort of reminds me in this moment of like the urgency that Julian had, right? It was if we find this out in 10 years, what hell has been wrought in the meantime, right? Where none of us knew, and somehow all these people, elites know, but the people don't get to know this when it has to do with the presidential election. And I'm sympathetic to that, the urgency. I felt that urgency being in a community that was being treated outside what I thought outside the boundaries of what civil liberties could permit. The urgency is people's real lives. And that was the logic behind the disclosure of the Steele dossier. And lots of people thought that we should have waited until we verified every single sentence in it, right? Which is normally the standard for journalism, is that you verify everything and you put it out. But I will say that all the time, every single day in every single papers publish on this lawsuit was filed. Here are the allegations. They haven't borne out every single allegation in there. They're just saying, this is a thing that's happening of public importance and you deserve to know. And that was really the philosophy that we brought to the publication of the Steele dossier. This was something we didn't know about the truth within it, but the fact that it was being taken seriously was enough to justify disclosure to the public. And
how did you get away with it?
We argued, we had a lot of litigation, a lot of very expensive litigation. We were sued by a series of Russian oligarchs, a tech oligarch, Michael Cohen, who was Donald Trump's personal attorney at the time. And we made a version of the argument that I just said, which was all of the time we publish things that are part of an official process. And we're not saying we know what the outcome is or every single piece of it is true. When a lawsuit is filed, a complaint is stated, we don't say every single part of this is true. We just say, hey, public, you deserve to know that someone's making these allegations against Bill Cosby or Harvey Weinstein or someone else. This is a parallel thing. We never said that we knew it to be true. We said it is terrifying that this is being circulated at the top levels of government and the public deserves to know. And the courts bought that argument, as I think they rightfully should have.
I'm going to break the rules here just to let another student of mine ask a question. And he says, how true is it to say that the US government's efforts to persecute Assange are just a way to silence journalists who do their job of bringing the truth to the people?
I don't think that's all it is, to be honest, and not to give too much credit to anybody, but I don't think that this is only motivated by retaliation. I think that there's a legitimate difference of opinion on what the limits for journalism can be. I think there are a lot of people that believe the line for responsible journalism stops at national security concerns. And I don't think everyone agrees with that. I think a lot of people look at the harm the US empire has committed in a variety of contexts, which I think as we sit here in 2022 is undeniable, right? Like, all of our military exploits haven't gone according to plan. Harm has happened. We know that. And so providing absolute deference to the US government is unthinkable to others. And yet to others, they're like, well, there has to be some kind of line. We have to protect people from being hurt in the line of their work in some way. And it's that sort of murkiness that I do think is the honest motivation for this kind of prosecution. Now, do I think it's the right thing to do right now? Do I think this is the right moment for this, that this is the right case for this? I do not. But I don't think it's solely a form of retaliation.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has been exactly what I thought it would be, which has been fascinating and fun. To call discussions of war crimes fun is sort of twisted of me, but Nabiha Syed, thank you so much for your time.
Well,
and also, I don't know that people know this, but you have no internet. In all of downtown Brooklyn, there's no internet. So you very quickly put together a little stand with your phone on it, and you're real pro.
Oh, well, thank you. Happy to make it work. This was a great discussion. Thank you so much. And thanks for the great questions to those not.
All the people on the right-hand side of the screen. Yeah. So I'm going to hand this back to Joanne. Joanne, thank you for making this possible. I came to you with this crazy idea and you said, yes. So that was, music to my ears. Thank you everyone for your role in this. And thanks to people who asked those great questions.
We were happy to do it. Thank you. It was a fascinating discussion on a really interesting topic. So thank you for bringing the idea and the speaker to us.
Sure.
I want to thank everybody who's attending this, and I want to invite you all to next week's event. Next Wednesday, the Rockefeller Center will be hosting Justice John T. Broderick, who will be discussing changing the conversation around mental health. This is a public lecture honoring Bryce Acree, who's a member of Dartmouth's class of 2009. And we hope you will join us for this special event. Thank you all very much for joining.